Hi class, welcome to Introductions 101. We're going to use these notes to prepare ourselves for tomorrow's writing workshop where we practice our introductions in class. So the method for introductions that we're going to be using is going to be called the funnel. There are a lot of different ways that you can organize your introduction, but we like to start with the funnel because it's a great organizational tool for emerging writers when we're kind of learning the ropes of what an essay should include. The funnel method helps set up a clear outline for our essay, and it also forces you to stay narrowly focused and on task. This encourages deeper level critical thinking. Most of our students tend to not want to get specific because there's this fear that if they're specific, you're going to run out of things to write about, but that's not really the case, and we're hoping that this helps you to start to think about it in a slightly different manner. We like the funnel method because it provides a great visual. We start out really broad with the hook. That's the mouth of our funnel. And then we move the information down into narrower and narrower categories through the tag, the context, until we all the way get down to our thesis statement, which is our most specific part of the essay. So we're moving from broad to narrow. Because we have each of these components, we want to make sure that we have good, clear notes that we can go back to about what each of these components are all about. So we've provided you with an introduction model. Our model is color-coded based on our 4 components. So we want to make sure that we have each of these 4 components in our introductions, but that you feel comfortable with what's expected for each. Our model is going to use our SGO story, The Bass, the River, and Sheila Mann, and we'll be referencing back to it while we're reviewing over the notes process. So let's scroll down to where we have our chart, and you have the link to the video that you're watching right now. We're going to start out with the hook. The hook is going to typically be 1 to 2 sentences. And I don't want you guys writing much more than this because it is really broad and we want to start getting focused in on our deeper concepts pretty much right away. But we do want our hook to be broad. So we're going to call this a broad, and I'm capitalizing this for emphasis, statement that introduces the big idea of the essay. And I'm actually going to add in here, when we're talking about the big idea is our topic. What is our essay about? Well, how do we do that? We are going to identify our topic in the prompt. This is really helpful when we go back and we do some highlighting because this keeps us focused on the prize. So tip, identify the topic in the prompt. Highlighting can be really helpful here. The other tip that we would like you to do for this particular section is we would like you to make sure that you are not referencing the text yet. So do not mention the title of the text, the author, the characters, or the plot. That all comes later. Here we're just making a broad sweeping statement. So if you notice in our model, having an important experience at a young age can change the way a person sees the world. We have no reference to the narrator or Sheila or fishing or a date. We're just focusing in on this kind of all-encompassing concept that could apply to the story, but could also apply to other stories outside of this. That's pretty much it for the hook. A lot of you might have heard of it as an attention grabber or a grabber. That's kind of a secondary purpose of a hook. We can actually add that in. So our secondary purpose is to get the reader's attention. We do this without doing anything fancy. We just do this through nice, clear, concise sentences. We want to avoid a question, a quote, that kind of stuff. That's a little bit more gimmicky, and we learned that when we were younger, and it makes a lot of sense that, you know, we use those kind of things when we're younger, but we're going to try to get more sophisticated here. So a statement is totally fine. Next, we're going to move into the tag sentence. The tag sentence is always just going to be one sentence. This is where we're starting to introduce the story. So tag is actually an acronym. We are going to introduce the title, author, and genre of the text. When we're talking about the genre, we basically just mean short story, poem, novel. We're not talking about like in the creative nonfiction piece. You're just going to give that baseline, what kind of text is this? But we're not just introducing the title, author, and genre. We are connecting the big idea from the hook to the text. So I'm going to kind of write this big and right here. Maybe I'll highlight it so that it stands out from title, author, and genre. But we also want this set up. So we're setting up how the big idea from the hook is present in the text. We're getting narrow. These texts, especially if we're doing a long text, can be about a lot of different things. Well, what does this text have to do with that big idea from the hook? So if we look to our sample in the short story, The Bass, the River, and Sheila Mant by W.D. Wetherell, the narrator's negative experience with his crush helps him to change the way he views relationships. That ties into how having an experience at a young age changes the perspective of a person, but it brings about how we see that specifically in this story that we're writing about. Tip for our tag sentence, it doesn't have to be in TAG order. You can introduce the genre first. If you want to say, in the short story, The Bass, the River, and Sheila Mant by W.D. Wetherell, you can say W.D. Wetherell's short story, The Bass, the River, and Sheila Mant. TAG is just a helpful acronym for you to remember what you need to include here. Moving on to context. Context here is where we're getting into plot summary. I'm going to have you put down here that context is usually 2 to 4 sentences. This is the longest chunk of your intro, but your intro is actually not all that long. This is where you're setting up plot background information. So I'm going to say here, set plot background info for what the text is about connected to the big idea. We get our big idea from our prompt, and so we're focusing in on what the prompt is actually asking about. Again, we don't need to set up everything that happens here. We just need what's relevant to the information that we're presenting. So for a tip here, pretend like your reader has read the text but needs a basic overview. This will kind of help guide you to present enough information without getting into a ton of unnecessary details. We have to kind of have a balance here. So I'm going to kind of write another little tip here about balance. And what we want to balance is we want to balance providing enough info to set up our point without getting into the nitty-gritty details that we'll actually need in our body. So this one, it's all about balance. We need to be specific, but we also need to just kind of set up that general overview here. This is kind of similar to what we were doing in our activity with Steele. You want to summarize the plot, but you don't want to get into all of the nitty-gritty details just yet. Last but not least, we have our thesis statement. Thesis statement is always one sentence only. A lot of people have a tendency to move away from the one sentence, so we need to stay focused here. Our thesis statement is going to make a bold argument about the big idea in the text and offer an overarching reason why it's true. This is super, super specific. We are going to justify the argument that we are making. This is really important because this is the backbone of your entire essay. Everything in this essay is going to be used to prove this thesis true. Our tip here for you is to answer the prompt and include your because. Your reason why your answer is true. We talked about before that people get scared to be specific, and they get really scared to be specific in their thesis. One thing to consider is this idea of open thesis versus closed thesis. An open thesis is when we have information that is open to interpretation. This is what we're going to use for English thesis statements. A closed thesis is what we really usually use in history. A closed thesis typically lists our 3 body paragraph points, whereas our open thesis is all about our overarching argument. In an open thesis, what we are tending to do is we're tending to use our body paragraphs to serve as evidence. In a closed thesis that we do for history, this is an argument that lists our 3 reasons that make up our body paragraphs. This, in some ways, is more informational. If you think about it in a history essay, you're trying to get in as many of those facts as possible. So if we go up and look at our example, if you take a look at the context here, we have some information about the story, who Sheila is, who the narrator is, how it all kind of connects. But we make an argument here that while the narrator views romantic relationships immaturely at the start of the story, experiencing Sheila's rejection helps him grow into a more mature approach of learning how to be himself. That is super, super specific here. Notice we're not listing three reasons. We're not basically saying the story shows that age changes a character and experience changes a character. We're really making a complex argument here. And we need this to develop our body paragraphs, which are what our notes are going to focus on tomorrow. So that's our quick overview. In class tomorrow during our workshop, we're going to get a chance to practice this and to really put this information into play. Thanks for taking the notes. Feel free to pause and rewind if need be, and we'll see you in class tomorrow.